Hey everybody, welcome to Beyond the Trip. In this episode, I'm going to be zooming out a little bit from thinking about psychedelics from an individual therapeutic perspective and taking a more systemic lens. As a part of this, I'm going to be joined by Natalie Ginsberg, who has worked at MAPS since 2014. Natalie founded the Policy and Advocacy department, where she served as its director for 5 years. She also initiated and co-developed the MAPS Health Equity Program. As Global Impact Officer, Natalie works for the responsible integration of psychedelics into mainstream culture to help set the setting for an ethical global movement. Before she joined MAPS, she worked as a policy fellow at the Drugs Policy Alliance, where she helped legalize medical cannabis in her home state of New York and worked to end New York's race-based marijuana arrests. Natalie currently lives in Los Angeles. She received her BA in history from Yale College and her Master's of Social Work from Columbia University. Natalie's also the co-founder of the Jewish Psychedelic Summit. We cover a lot of ground in this conversation about things that we're both really passionate about. We talk about the beginnings of her work in the social justice space, her work in drug policy reform, and her role as Global Impact Officer at MAPS. We talk about the promise and the complexity of psychedelics in the conflict resolution space and her research in this area. We talk about the importance of psychedelics for collective as well as individual healing. And we also dive into how important it is to find ways to hold and process both our grief and our joy, love, and playfulness. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. It feels like a really important thing to be talking about in the world right now. And it was so wonderful to spend some time diving into these issues with Natalie. Hi, Natalie. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. So great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, that's all right. It's just so lovely to have you here. And, it feels like a really lovely day to be doing this and having this conversation. Tomorrow I'm heading off for a week-long residential with MAPS, so the MDMA assisted psychotherapy for PTSD training with your colleagues, Bruce and Marcela, holding the space. And I'm going to be helping out, running a small group as a teaching assistant on that. So it's really special to be here doing this today.
Amazing. Lucky you. I just trainings are so special. I've been lucky to attend many over my decade at MAPS, and I actually developed some trainings, like our first training for therapists of color. And it's just the most extraordinary kind of container vortex experience, and you just develop such special relationships. And I know we were trying actually for two colleagues from Ramallah, two psychiatrists from Palestine, to make it to this training in Australia, and we were so disappointed the visa didn't work out in time.
Yes. I'm sorry on behalf of the Australian visa system. It's very complicated. It takes a long time. We're really disappointed too. We were really hoping they'd be able to make it. Last year I did the training myself as a participant. So I feel like I have a sense of that immersive, intensive nature that it's kind of like going into I really agree, like a vortex. And kind of with this, I think, 55 trainees coming and all of the staff from Monash University as well. And it's going to be big.
It's pretty exciting to do it in Australia, where you have actually the more legal ability to be doing it outside of research. It's really extraordinary. I haven't been to a training yet in a country where that was a possibility. A training I just attended most recently was in Bosnia, actually. And it was a pretty extraordinary training, but there definitely isn't legal access or even research yet. But we actually had 10 Bosnian folks, 4 Ukrainian folks, and there are actually 20 Arab therapists from around the Arab world, including 10 Palestinian therapists. So it was a really special mix of community. And the Bosnia training was so powerful with people from all around the world. So there was a lot of pain and frustration about, this ongoing trauma that's happening. It's not post PTSD, it's trauma. And at the end, as I know you've experienced at the MAPS trainings, the last night, it's really important for us. There's a lot of like sitting and watching heavy videos. It's really important. We have this beautiful dance party to kind of move the energy and connect and get out of our mind and feel into our bodies. And it's really always one of the highlights of the experience for me, at least. And on our last night in Bosnia, the morning of the, before the dance party, there started being some folks, like there was a Palestinian American who was like, this does not feel right. I cannot party, that we're in the midst of slaughter in Gaza. I do not feel okay dancing or partying. And we're like, completely understand that. And what we ended up doing, led by the incredible Bruce and Marcella, was holding this really beautiful sharing grief circle where we're all in this big room and we were invited to pick up a rock and all take turns on the microphone, kind of just sharing grief of really difficult things that were going on. Many were connected to world conflicts, but not all things. And we spent I think 2 hours and everyone was crying and sharing. It was really powerful and heavy, but powerful experience, and kind of ended with these rocks in the middle of the room in a circle. And then what we ended up being able to doing is Marcella's an artist. She was an art teacher, and she kind of made them into this heart kind of shape and put these candles around these rocks in the center. And then we did start to put on some music, and it turned into a really beautiful, gorgeous, powerful dance party. But we were literally dancing around these stones. They were in the absolute center of our dance floor. So it was we are not running away from what's going on. We are not escaping our grief. We are dancing with our grief, holding it together. And literally at one point I walked in and a Palestinian attendee from the West Bank was doing dabka, this traditional Palestinian dance with Marcella and Bruce. And it was just turned into this joyful celebration, but it didn't mean we were ignoring anything of what was happening. And it felt like such an important kind of part of this healing work was that we have to hold space for the pain. And then we also have to make space for the joy and the healing. But we can't do that if we can't really be with the pain and acknowledge that. And so that just honestly was such a profound moment for me for that training, and just feeling called to share that based on our conversations with grief and all of that.
So important, isn't it? That kind of that idea and that the representation of having the things that represented the grief and the pain, and then being able to dance as well. It's both and. Yes, I'm feeling a lot of grief, and I would like to feel into some joy maybe, or some somatic processing of that, which then can become joy. And I think, it's so important for where we find ourselves in the world right now is how do we hold both those things and honor both.
Totally. And if we can't access our joy and our love, then we can't vision a new way forward in a world built on love and joy. If we're only in our anger and fear place, then that's the world we're going to recreate. So for me, it's absolutely imperative that we find places for joy and love. It's not frivolous, but it's literally absolutely imperative and necessary if we actually want to change the kind of systems that we're creating. So that's my prayer.
Yes, I am so with you on that. And that's one of the reasons I started the Embodying Playfulness group, was that so much of the somatic psychotherapy that I trained in was focused on kind of processing trauma in the body, which is really, really important. And also we can use those processes to process joy and to really soak up all of the resources of play and joy, and that we kind of need to try to do both.
Amen.
Yeah.
Your group sounds amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to run another one hopefully next year, actually. But yeah, I'm really excited too. And I'd love to hear more about that training, and kind of the importance of that work feels really something that'd be really good to discuss, and why that's so important and helpful at this particular time in history. You know, you and I actually, I mean, I met you. I don't know if you met me, because there was a lot of people there, but we shared space at a workshop run by Asa and Ros Watts called Love and Grief in the Shadow of War. And I was so moved by actually the whole experience, and spent a lot of time kind of really in my grief and really allowing myself to cry, which was really beautiful. And your talk was really, really touched me. And so I thought, I need to have this woman on the podcast in the early stages, and I'm really just starting out with this project. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for saying that. Yeah, Roz Watts is really an incredible friend and teacher, and it was such an honor when she invited me to that. And I have to say, over my decade of MAPS, I've just gone on so many panels, did so many talks, and that was like the hardest talk for me to prepare for. I actually almost tried to back out of it before. It was like, so thank you for seeing me and feeling that. But it was, for listeners to understand, it was called Love and Grief in the Shadow of War. And it was me and Gabor Mate, and I invited two Palestinian activists and therapists, friends of mine, both also psychedelically inclined. One is a psychedelic therapist. And it was just really hard to like put words to that. And I kind of was feeling like, who am I to speak about the shadow, for me, my shadow of war, living safely in LA, though I am a Jewish person and very impacted by what's going on. It's completely different, of course, than, my dear Palestinian friends. And Gabor Mate, who's someone I so deeply respect, and how he thinks about trauma. And he's taught me so much. And also the way that he speaks actually about this conflict can be quite difficult for a lot of Jewish people, including myself sometimes. So that was another interesting dynamic, right? How to hold trauma and see how that comes up in yourself. And one of my Palestinian friends on that panel with me, Suli Khatib, who's a co-founder of Combatants for Peace, he speaks all the time about the idea of collective liberation, and that no one is free and healed unless everyone is, and perpetrator, victim, everyone has different roles, but we really need this deep healing for everyone. And he really feels that and works for that. And so I think that was what was a bit also challenging for me, that as much respect as I have for Gabor, he tends to be focused understandably on the horrific experience of Palestinians right now, and is not really always able to hold space for the grief of Israelis or Jewish people.
Yeah. And that was what struck me about listening to you and some of the other presenters was that actually I totally understand that it's been really hard to prepare for, because it's so complex, and we're trying to put words to things that actually are so horrific that words are really quite inadequate in many ways. But that also, that the way that you were able to kind of hold both the horror of what was happening in Palestine and in Gaza, and the Jewish grief, and kind of the complexities of doing that. And I think you did that really beautifully. And
Thank you.
And I just really needed a space just to go as a participant, as a therapist working in this time, and just to kind of be with my own emotions, instead of kind of being out and holding other people with theirs. And so it was really, really special and important on a personal level for me to have that time to do that.
Thank you so much for sharing that, and I'm excited to share that with Roz too. She's such a special soul to have that vision and create that space the way she did.
Yeah. And there's lots of themes around that we'll kind of get more into today. But before we kind of do, I guess maybe we'll start at the beginning with you. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about your history, your background in this work, how you began with MAPS, and what drew you to the kind of social justice space that you find yourself in now.
Just taking a pause because, of course, there's so much to that answer.
Yeah. Take it wherever you want.
I mean, I guess just based on what we were saying earlier, I'm called to start with an early touch point when you ask about why I'm drawn to social justice. I do believe it's my experience as a Jewish person that has really always drawn me to justice work. When I was young, like my favorite book when I was like 7 or 8 was called When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit, which is like, you know, pretty sad in a lot of ways that's how like young Jewish kids sometimes grow up reading all about, you know, the horrific things. But I'm grateful that what it allowed me to see and was that, like, you know, how messed up societies can be. And I was living in New York City in, you know, the 90s. I was born in 89. So I would say it's probably one of, if not the safest times for Jews in like history. And reading about that, I was, you know, I felt quite safe, but I was like, well, looking around my country, who is not safe? Like there are other people here who are having the horrible experiences that I'm reading about, maybe not concentration camps, but a prison system can be, you know, I don't mean to like compare it, but it's a pretty horrific thing as well. And so that kind of always opened me up to this work around also racial justice and seeing that people could be discriminated against based on their ethnicity and identity. And that really drew me to working around in systems of mass incarceration. In college, I like tutored in a maximum security prison and was drawn to just understanding how to make changes in that system. And I thought that I actually would be a public defender. And one summer I interned for the Brooklyn DA's office, which was, I thought it would be helpful to like see the other side before I was a defender. And I was so frustrated doing that job because I was getting arrest after arrest of like 13-year-old Black boys arrested for like specks of marijuana, you know. And at the time I was in college at Yale, you know, smoking weed myself with my friend whose, you know, mother was like a judge at that court, and we had not a problem in the world. And even if a cop had approached us, it, you know, wouldn't have been a big deal. And understanding that these kids' lives were being ruined by these marijuana arrests. So that was really eye-opening and really kind of got me looking a little bit more towards drug policy reform as this site of like perpetuation of injustice, especially in a racially discriminate manner. And I got drawn into social work because I was like, I kind of want to, the system's so black and white. Like we were speaking a bit about this black and whiteness, and I was drawn to making change in the system, but not necessarily having to conform to the black and white energy. And then I got to social work school, and I was working as a therapist for people arrested for prostitution at a court. There's like a alternative sentencing court. And then I was working in the South Bronx as a guidance counselor at a middle school. And both of those contexts kind of reinforced that even the like individual so-called issues really often were connected to such systemic issues like racism or policing, or, you know, my like middle school kids would be treated like criminals by police just walking to school and doing nothing. So that really also kind of led me back into this interest of policy reform as a way of helping kind of stem some of the tides of trauma that I was seeing. And so then I ended up working at the Drug Policy Alliance, which was doing incredible work on drug reform. It does domestically in the US, it does global work. And it actually was, when I joined, was just launching this campaign around marijuana arrests. And now it's kind of common knowledge relatively that marijuana arrests are very racially biased, but that was actually a lot of their work. They like commissioned the studies, they did media campaigns to raise awareness. So I was really lucky I got to work with them on that. And then they moved me to the medical marijuana campaign, which I was like, okay, cool. I didn't really understand actually the power of the medicine, and that got me into plant medicine. Long story short, started looking into some psychedelic stuff, and I was like, what is this that like is actually addressing the root source instead of just the symptoms? Like, how can 3 sessions of psychedelics help someone with addiction or PTSD, which are things in social work school I was being taught there's no way to heal from. You can just reduce the symptoms and manage them. So ultimately, I was really drawn to this psychedelic work because I saw that it was helping people address the root source of things and actually healing. And when they looked at the root source, it was often like systemic injustice. So I saw it also as a means of helping motivate people to make change in their community on top of the individual healing. So that's the bit of the spiel.
I love. Thank you. Yeah, there's so much richness in what you just shared, and it's. I'm sure that's like one part of a really long story too, right? But I think if I think about when I was thinking about this podcast, the Beyond the Trip, it's like therapy podcast, and the focus is like. My initial idea was to talk about the psychotherapy part of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, as we are here in Australia, very fortunately moving into clinical use. But as a human and as a therapist, and the way I was trained, which in Australia feels like I'm a psychologist by background. I'm clinical psych trained in the UK originally. And in Australia, I often end up working in places with a lot of social workers because how I think and how I was trained to think is much more kind of wide lens, thinking about social inequalities and the impact of kind of systemic power imbalances and the trauma that creates that then causes suffering and distress. And so that training led me into a human rights organization called Foundation House, which is a service over here that works with survivors from conflict, so torture and trauma counselling service for refugee and migrant and asylum-seeking populations in Australia. And so that my journey into psychedelics kind of came through that in an interesting way. It's so I was doing that work and then kind of very steeped in working with a lot of PTSD. And then I actually heard about MAPS and heard about the work that you were doing with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy and thought, wow, I really need to understand this. And like you was kind of drawn into that idea of looking at what's the root cause, like what's actually underneath this. And then how do we also, because our individual healing is just one, but it's very important. But it's also how do we take that out into the world? And this is the integration piece. And then how do we take that out into the world to be the best kind of humans that we can and to start to change some of these systems? And that's why it's so inspiring to hear you talk about that kind of policy reform, which is such an important piece of this work. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. I didn't know that part of your trajectory. It's beautiful to hear.
It was. It's been an interesting space. And you've spoken a little bit about some of the things that you do in your role as global impact officer in that MAPS at the moment. I know you've been there 10 years, is that right? Yeah, so a few different roles. So do you want to share a little bit about like the focus of that and what you do as part of that role and why it's important?
Sure. Yeah, I'd say the majority of my time at MAPS are like I founded the policy team and served as the policy director. But then I found that I was doing things that were kind of peripherally policy related, like developing this training for therapists of color or doing a lot of global work that was a combination of community building and policy change. And I actually started finding I'd be in DC lobbying and I'd have legislators literally reference like a Law and Order TV episode about MDMA instead of the research. And I was so frustrated. And then I realized like, okay, I can be frustrated or I can live in LA and actually work with people who are telling these stories and help them tell more accurate stories. So that was a big motivation for me to kind of shift into this global impact conception of like, how are we helping our society make space for and responsibly integrate psychedelics in a way that's safe, and that makes sense and that is equitable. Like, that's another big piece. There's so much we see around so-called psychedelic exceptionalism, which is this idea that psychedelics are like the good drugs and other drugs are the bad drugs. And because of course that means psychedelic users are the good people and people using other drugs are the bad people, and also gives false notions of safety with psychedelics. And any substance can be dangerous or safe depending on how we consume them. So I think that's a really important piece. But yeah, with global impact work, I've really appreciated that I've kind of been able to do many different pieces of work. I'm like currently, I developed in that time a study. Well, actually, maybe it started as when I was policy director, but a study with two colleagues, Dr. Lior Roseman and Antoine Saka, interviewing Palestinians and Israelis who drink ayahuasca together. And right now I'm developing another study interviewing with Columbia. Dr. Jay Sibelius is the PI, and working with colleagues Bea Vache and McKenna Layden. And the study is interviewing MDMA, like underground couples therapists, because we're seeing that it's such a common use. And before MDMA was criminalized, it was used quite like that was one of the main use cases for MDMA. But we have very, very limited research and understanding on what's going on with that. So very interested talking about getting to the root. I'm like, we can heal the parents. There's a lot of healing that can emerge from there. Maybe I'll leave it at that, but I'll say it's just a kind of general global impact. My work with that is also just kind of on narrative building, storytelling, and how MAPS is approaching that both in the US and around the world.
Yeah, that's really awesome. I'd love to ask you a bit more about those two research projects. That also, I think that in Australia, I think there's something. One of my reasons for starting the podcast, there's a few, but one of them was that, it's been an interesting journey, the psychedelic field in Australia. There's been people who've been interested in this work here for quite a long time, and there's been research slowly building. And then all of a sudden, quite quickly, really, in terms of like the maturity of the movement here, I guess, it was rescheduled and so that happened, I think, faster than I thought it would and faster than my colleagues thought it would, and has left a bit of a gulf. There's still a lot of misunderstandings in the community about what we're doing, about what psychedelic assisted therapy is, and so I think it's really important to talk about like the different layers, because there's the way it's been rescheduled here is psychedelic assisted therapy tied into for people with treatment resistant depression, with psilocybin assisted therapy, as you know, I'm sure, and then MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD. And that work is really important. But of course, it's just one part of how psychedelics can be really helpful. And the couples counseling, is such an important thing. And I actually don't know if it's a super common knowledge here in Australia that MDMA's first use was that it was actually being used a lot like that before it was made illegal. And that, you were just hinting here that like working with parents to enable them to reduce the conflict, to enable them to come together, to be more aligned, communicate better, is going to be so helpful for the children, right? Because when the parents are working well, the attachment with the child is going to be stronger and more secure, and that has all kinds of implications for how they are in the world.
Totally. And I actually have a dream to try to develop to see how MDMA could be supportive for also divorce mediation. Also for the children's sake, but for it's like both either coming together or separating, but with love and respect and understanding. And there's so much pain usually, and so kind of being able to heal or hold space for that pain. But yeah.
I think that would be a really awesome piece of research. And I know there's some people here in Australia who are also thinking about research into couples therapy with MDMA and trying to look for
Oh,
funding for that. And
you should connect them with me. I'd love to talk to them about it. And I'm
yes,
sure Rick would too.
yes, yes, I think I have a feeling they may already be connected. If they're not, I will definitely. Yeah, because I think it's really important. And there's, if you think about, how we are as humans and how we heal, there's us as an individual and our one-on-one therapeutic work, or the work we might do with ourselves, either, in therapy or psychedelics, or just healing ourselves in a meditation or yoga, however people want to do that. And then there's the family system, isn't there? And then there's the sort of wider social cultural systems around people. And it sounds like
Right.
that sounds like something that was really important in the work that you did with the ayahuasca research. Do you want to speak a little bit to that and how that even idea came about, and tell us a little bit about that research?
Sure. I think different versions of that idea have kind of been like in the ether. People would kind of make jokes about a lot of you just put MDMA in the water supply in Israel and see what happens.
Yeah.
But for me, it was actually like when Trump was elected, that I was like, okay, it's time.
Mm.
2016, way back when, first time
Mm.
around,
Mm.
that
Yeah.
that we really thought it was time. I was also really interested in doing that work with Republicans and Democrats and using MDMA to see how
Mm.
that would be helpful. But
Mm-hmm.
Lior Roseman was a, a friend and colleague, and we had actually traveled around Israel with Rick and Stan Groff and this really special group. And we kind of talked a lot on that trip. It was like in early 2015,
Mm.
about what what using these substances for peace building and conflict resolution, transformation, restorative
Mm.
justice, what these things could look like. So
Mm.
um, to set out, for me, it was really important that before we just tried to try something, I wanted to
Mm.
understand what was already happening, which,
Mm.
honor definitely is more, I'm learning a more feminine, or, not that feminine is always identified with the gender, but like the more,
Mm.
the yin to the yang, the energy of like, okay, let's like see what's here before we
Mm-hmm.
charge forward.
Yep.
So I tend to really love these kind of qualitative studies, understanding where we're at before
Mm.
we do interventional work. And so
Mm.
where we were at was that in the land, there were ayahuasca ceremonies that had both Israeli and Palestinian participants. And
Mm.
so we wanted to interview those participants to understand what was happening in their experience. And,
Mm.
an important thing to understand was that these were not ceremonies with the explicit intention of like peace building or conflict
Yep.
resolution. They were ayahuasca ceremonies people go to for healing or for, spiritual connection.
Mm.
And for something that was interesting is that for Israelis, there were many places that they could find this. So for them to go to a ceremony that had Palestinians present was kind of a self-selecting group in general, people that were
Mm.
really excited to be in a joint space. Um, and for Palestinian attendees, and this was, many years ago, there were very few options. So if they
Mm.
wanted to sit with ayahuasca, they were likely going to have to sit with Israelis. So even that was an interesting starting point where people
Yeah.
were coming from a different place in that way. And most of the ceremonies were still like majority Jewish Israeli.
Mm.
But there were a lot of powerful pieces like music that would be both in Arabic and Hebrew, and kind of there were
Mm.
efforts in these ceremonies to create this space that had space for everyone.
Yep.
And yeah, and some really beautiful things emerged from those interviews, and that led my colleague Lior to work with the new colleague Sami Awad to develop a more interventional study where they actually brought people, activists, artists, friends of ours to Spain to sit with ayahuasca with the intention of peace building. So that was also really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And it feels like, yeah, I've read the paper that you put out about this, and I was really struck by a lot of things in there. And I think one of those was the power of the music, and listening to song from each other's culture, and kind of um and kind of that can be a really healing thing in itself. And I also
Massively.
really appreciated how in that article you all kind of spoke to the complexities. And when you're doing qualitative research, there's always going to be kind of challenges like this, and that kind of power imbalance that you spoke about that was kind of unavoidable around having um, majority Israelis and then Palestinians are always going to be a self-selecting sample, but it's still so important. It's how I so agree with you. I did my PhD was all qualitative research. It's just how my brain works. I'm much better in that. I think it's a therapist thing as well. I'm much better in
Makes
that
sense.
space. Yeah. I think it's a really important part of to the picture to kind of understand this. And I also really liked how in the article there was kind of he was speaking, or the writers, all of you were speaking about the importance of doing the inner healing work for each other, and kind of, but also the collective healing and being with and processing collective trauma, and that kind of bringing those, and ayahuasca circles are naturally kind of happening in a collective ritual based community kind of space. But sometimes in the kind of more new age side of things, it can be very individualistic, can't it? Like focused on people working with themselves, but the importance of trying to find a way to work as a collective as well was mentioned, which I really
Totally.
liked.
And we found that even if that wasn't the stated intention, just by virtue of the context, the set and setting,
Yeah.
people did have more of that collective experience than maybe in other ayahuasca ceremonies. And there were often stories of people, you know, Israeli people having an experience of being a Palestinian person, and also vice versa, a Palestinian friend experience being behind the gun of an Israeli soldier in ceremony, like crazy
Yeah. Yeah.
powerful things, understanding the so-called other and healing this more broad collective shared trauma. And it was quite profound. And yeah, the intergenerational trauma piece is like so deep, and to
Yeah.
be able to like touch that together in ceremony was really important. But I'd also say like what I believe is that it's also really important that people have this opportunity to do their own work individually,
Mm,
and then also maybe in their community, like for a
mm,
Jewish person to be around other Jewish people to heal some of their intergenerational trauma before being in a shared space with Palestinians, and then healing that collective trauma. And
yeah.
so I think that was another item of like how when it makes sense to like come together in that healing, and when maybe sometimes it's appropriate to like give yourself a different kind of container to drop into that. And you mentioned
Mm,
the music piece, and it
mm,
was so many people really spoke to the music playing such an
mm,
important role. And as you said, especially hearing songs in a Israelis are trained to be so terrified of Arabic. So there was all these
mm,
stories of Israelis hearing Arabic and realizing how beautiful it was, and feeling
mm,
like so open, and how one Israeli started learning Arabic after, but
mm,
something I'm called to share is that in most ayahuasca spaces, people are not singing in their language. They're
mm,
maybe singing from a different culture that stewarded ayahuasca, or in
mm,
Spanish, and which also, I really honor keeping medicines in their context. But I think there's also
mm,
something really important about creating spaces for people to have access to their own ancestral music and traditions when they're in
mm,
that deep medicine space. And
yeah.
I know personally that's been very profound. I co-founded the Jewish Psychedelic Summit a few years ago because I really wanted people to have access, like I did, to spaces that I felt, my ancestors present, and the energetics of the song. It just, had a different
Mm,
experience for me. And, and luckily in Judaism, there actually are a lot different plant medicines in our history, including
mm,
medicines that when you mix together have the same reactions as ayahuasca. So I'm a big believer in like inviting people to the best that they can to trace their lineage if that's available to them, and kind of understand what plants, what songs, what traditions your ancestors were using way back when. And I know especially a lot of white people have lost their connection and kind of lost their culture in service of just being like, oh, I'm part of this, like I'm white. But actually when people are able to trace back, if they're able, they're, almost every people at one point was an earth-based tradition, working with plants, having different traditions, songs available. And I think there's really profound healing in that when that's available. And I know it's not available for everyone.
Yes, I love that. I really agree with you. And it's interesting, actually. I was, this is just kind of how much to share about this, was kind of a long kind of story, but I was having another conversation with someone who's coming on the podcast from IPAT, which is an Indigenous psychedelic therapy organization in Australia. And Gemstone is her name. I'm going to be interviewing her, some of her colleagues, in a few weeks' time, talking about just exactly what you're speaking to, actually, that in Australia, we have obviously a very rich Indigenous tradition here, but also a lot of wounding and trauma around that. And one of the things that she was, and there's also, and with the psychedelic movement, there's a real interest in wanting to honor Indigenous wisdom without cultural appropriation. And people are often asking, like, how do I do that? I want to, like, I'm coming from a really good place of like kind of wanting to honor the traditions, but not engage in cultural appropriation. And she shared very similar thing to what you shared, which is actually this ancestral work is important for all of us. And that, what tracing back your own ancestral roots is something that is really healing. And she also said, for people who perhaps don't know, they might not know their history, it's in your DNA, it's in your body. And so sitting with your body and being present with that can allow it to come through in a way, in like a knowing that's not up here in the mind, in the head, but in the body.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that the whole thing, but especially that last piece. So powerful. And when we think about how people so-called discovered ayahuasca, right? There's a lot of different plants out there. So there must have been some very deep listening to your body, to something to guide people to mix those plants together. And part of what's happening with this Jewish psychedelic community right now is, though we have, in the Torah references to different psychedelic plants, we don't have a continuous tradition of working with these. So there really is a lot of listening we're having to do to ourselves and co-creation and what feels right. How are we bringing something forward that has existed before, but we don't quite know? And it really is a lot of deep listening, both to ourselves and in community. And it's honestly a very powerful process just in that itself,
Yeah. It's beautiful. And I think I'm English, and half English, half Welsh. And, there's a lot of psilocybin mushrooms that grow in the ground in the UK. And a lot of our early cultures were oral, right? If we go right back, there wasn't written word yet in the same way. And so I'm very curious to, understand and learn more about the early people in the UK, the earth-based people, the pagan rituals, and what kind of their relationship was like with psilocybin. And some of that we don't know exactly. There's lots of theories and people have all these ideas, but maybe some part of us does know, like maybe somewhere inside of us we do.
Totally. Well, we brought up Roz Watts at the beginning of this, and I'm called to bring her up again because we've had some beautiful conversations about this, and she's taught me a bit more about Druid culture. And, she started Acer that's based on different like trees and connecting to nature. And so even if, there's these traditions, like the Druid tradition is so based on trees and plants, and again, like maybe we lost the mushroom piece that's there, right? And it just there's so much to reconnect with that's quite powerful, and that's that's cool to know that you're on that journey. And yeah,
I was really inspired by hearing about the research that you did with the ayahuasca circles, and also I've been kind of, that led me into following and reading up about Lior Roseman as well. And is the work that he has done in Spain published yet, or is that still kind of being written up? Do you know? Just for the
I
podcast
don't
listeners.
think, yeah, I don't think it's published. However, he's done a lot of presentations around it. I would
Great.
check out a talk that he did with Sami at Psychedelic Science
Great.
2023. That's online and available, and that's, I think, one of the most robust talks that's available online that goes into
Yeah.
that. And actually, there was a Tim Ferriss podcast episode that also talked about this work. So if you
Great.
Google Lior Roseman and Sami Awad, or just ayahuasca Palestinians Israelis, this is what will come up, and there will be things to find. But I know I don't think that he published the research yet. And something that was interesting is because the people that came to Spain were activists, artists, people that are in community that have experiences of psychedelics already, because they didn't want that to be the first time.
Yep.
So they actually weren't able to show much change and like openness. Like there wasn't a statistical, so it really, it's interesting where research doesn't always serve like the kind of work that you're trying to do. And, I know Lior did develop some scales, but I'm even encountering this right now in couples therapy too. It's like the scales are so inadequate, and you could make your own scale, but then it's less effective to compare your research to other things. And so in that way, having standard scales is helpful. But like with couples therapy, there's no scale to indicate if you have a healthy breakup. It's like only about staying together. And we're like, well, what if the resolution is actually a loving breakup? But it's like, no, that would be like a failure. And we're like, that doesn't seem right. And so it is just one of those things where all the systems are really like not created for the kind of gray area, understanding the root source of things. They're just so focused on like as like a
The
kind of
category.
focused category. Yeah, exactly. The rigidity, which is a bummer, and which is also why I like our qualitative study, because
That's
our
what I
first
was about to
study.
say. Yeah, that's why we need both. Hey, like we do. We really need especially in these newer kind of areas of research. We need the qualitative to kind of help the quantitative just shift and be kind of up to date, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that, as a psychologist, I mean, there's many, I spent kind of 7 years really working very directly with refugee and asylum seekers as a therapist, and still kind of hold that work really close, and still something that I do in a kind of a less direct clinical work kind of a way. But the thing that breaks my heart, as well as all of the conflicts that are happening in the world right now, of which there are, obviously the Middle East is in a really terrible state, in Israel, Palestine, and also where I used to live on the border of Thailand and Myanmar, and that is in a really, really challenging situation at the moment, and hasn't
Congo,
really been
Sudan.
talked about. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Afghanistan, Sudan, and I look at all of that and I think about the intergenerational trauma that creates, and the generations and generations and generations of pain and suffering that then kind of can lead into, through that kind of traumatized way of thinking, can lead into more conflict and more pain and more suffering. And so I'm really interested in and passionate about trying to find ways to heal that, so that we can perhaps try to break some of these ongoing cycles.
Amen. That's why I think we resonate so much with each other, because that's exactly how I understand things and why I'm so motivated to do this work. And in particular with Israel and Palestine, as a Jewish person, I see that so deeply, that Jews have survived thousands of years. Like we talk about the Holocaust, that was just one thing. Like everywhere we've lived, especially in Europe and Christian countries especially, we've been murdered, raped, chased out of our homes like every 100, 200 years for the most part. And so having all of that unhealed trauma, then you have the Holocaust, then you're dumped into Israel, and then people, how I see it is, Jews have not healed all of our trauma, and a lot of what's happening with the horrors of the Israeli government, what they're capable of committing, to me is like kind of unprocessed trauma being taken out, unfortunately, on Palestinians that did not have anything to do with our thousands of years of trauma. But I also acknowledge that in the recent years, of course, Israelis living there have experienced terror attacks and different forms of trauma. So of course it's become complex, and and of course when Israel was formed, all the countries that Jews were living in for 1,000 years or more in the Arab world, not perfectly, but they had much better lives than in Christian Europe. But then when Israel was formed, they were all kicked out of their homes, and so that was also a lot of trauma and rupture. But I just see those cycles going on, and seeing in the world right now, not necessarily able to hold that broader context, and just being able to vilify like these horrible, evil people, which the intergenerational trauma doesn't excuse anything, but it feels like very important context, that it doesn't come out of nowhere. This feeling of everyone hates you, you're never safe, all of our neighbors want us dead, we don't want us to exist, there's nowhere for us to go. That is the underlying feeling of many Jews and of Israeli like philosophy in that way. So it's tough. And with our studies, with that research, or with the interviews, there are a lot of different elements of that came out. And we tend to see in psychedelic world this idea of like spiritual bypassing, and that we can say, okay, well, when we take psychedelics, we're all the same, like there's no difference, we're all just humans or light beings. And though that is true, there's also a lack of context of like, maybe we're all human beings, but in this world we have different experiences here. And like, so I feel like making space in psychedelic community for this, not like, I don't see colors, we're all the same, but like, how can we all be the same, but acknowledge how different our experiences. Like, this Palestinian friend's quote is in my mind from that study of like, yes, we're all spiritual light beings, but when I go to a checkpoint trying to cross, I can't be like, hey, I'm just a spiritual light being. Like, he's treated like a Palestinian man, and that's a hard thing to be treated as at a checkpoint in Israel.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's, for me, it's like thinking about, as you're talking, I was just thinking about the importance of this kind of work and with collective trauma and taking it out. And then how do you help people to take it out into the world? How do you integrate that? What do you need around that? And I don't have the answers to this question, but like, I think it's really important to think about that. Is what is it that we need to do, and how do we support ourselves and other people to do that really well?
I feel like it's like the question of everything,
right,
and
right.
that is definitely part of what Lior and Sami were trying to understand in Spain. And I definitely believe that one aspect of the so-called solution to that question, or the answer, is being in community and having shared experiences of this collective trauma healing, and really understanding both your own ancestral trauma and others, and how it's collective and how it's different, and really just making space for the grief. We also started the conversation talking about that, and I feel like grief is really the most powerful opener. Like, if you can get to your grief and feel that pain, and make space for other people's grief, there's just a lot more room to grow from there than when you're not feeling your grief and your pain, and then you have this like fear and hatred that's kind of blocking it, so you don't have to feel the pain, and then that allows a lot of kind of nastier things to grow from there.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think before we were recording, I was talking a bit about just to use like a kind of a small personal example, I guess, of the impact of kind of trauma on my ability to have a conversation, to really hear someone with a different opinion. That, I think recently I've been kind of, I'm recording this just after the US election and really feeling a lot of strong emotions about that. And knowing that I can feel that, and that those strong emotions make it harder for me to hear another person with a different perspective. And knowing that actually what I need to do over the next few weeks is personally just to kind of go inside and to be with those feelings and to process and to kind of really deeply feel them, so that I can do what I really believe in, which is, if we want to kind of move away from the polarization that is happening in all sorts of different ways in the world right now, is that we kind of do need to learn how to be able to listen to each other. And that, I grew up with so much privilege, and this is a small example, right? But if we're talking about something like people in Israel, Palestine, generations on both sides of trauma, there's so much. It's huge. And so if we can find some ways to help some of that to be healed, so that people can come together, and that would be amazing to me. It's such important work.
I pray. It's so unfathomably terrifying to conceive of, people in Gaza, the generations of trauma, not only that they have experienced, but that undoubtedly will happen from now. And so I hope we are all, as a global community, really going to help figure out ways to create healing where it's possible, but knowing that it's going to be a difficult step.
Yeah, and a long road. And yeah. And so, what do you think? I guess, thinking about your roles, different roles that you've had in MAPS, why do you, this moving into kind of social justice and psychedelics a little bit more, maybe from a slightly different angle, why do you think it's important to consider social justice and psychedelics together? Take that wherever you want. We've covered quite a bit of this already, but I feel like there's some more. So you start. I can.
Sure.
Yeah.
I love that psychedelics often can give people a broader view of the world and of themselves. So to me, when you're like zooming out on your understanding, it's kind of inevitable that you're going to see certain things that are working or not working in a certain way. So to me, I think there's really an inherent connection to understanding systems and injustice with psychedelics. And that's not to say that everyone that uses psychedelics is like a social justice warrior. And in fact, there's people all across the political spectrum, of course, that appreciate psychedelics. But if you don't have that under that opening, that framework to seeing, like, it's like it helps you just like see society, see our systems in a different light. And so I think it's really important to give people the tools to make sense of that, and to also understand, like, there's a lot of traumatic experiences that people can take on themselves as like, this is because I'm bad, or I'm like, there's just a lot of guilt and shame associated with certain things, that when they can understand that they can trace that to something that's a historical trauma or a systemic injustice that they're facing, I've seen it allow people to like release it and not hold it in that same way. So I think that's why it's also important for me that people have some understanding of social injustice as they're doing this work, because it helps them just make sense of more of the experience. And and I think there's also things like microaggressions, for example. Even the term microaggression, right, implies that it's micro, but if that's something that you experience every day throughout your life, that's a pretty like macro experience. And if you're on psychedelics in a very sensitive space and experience a little microaggression, but that triggers this feeling of of understanding this much bigger thing, that can be a huge rupture and a profound hopefully a healing, but can also be not healing, can be a traumatic experience in that state. So it's just so important also that therapists are really mindful of all of these different layers, because people are in such a heightened state of vulnerability, and every little or big thing will, every little thing is connected to a big thing. And even though that might be real outside of psychedelic experiences, in psychedelic experiences, it's like, extra zoomed in. And yeah.
Yeah, that's really important, isn't it? Because I guess a lot of people listening to this podcast will be kind of either psychedelic assisted therapists in Australia or people who are interested in that. And I think really, I think that to be any kind of good therapist, really, you've got to understand, haven't you, the different layers of social inequality and social injustice and how that might affect someone. But in this space, you spoke to something that's so true, that like everything gets magnified when you're on a psychedelic. You're heightened, you're sensitive. And so there's a real potential there for healing and also for harm if things are not kind of held really well for people.
Totally. And, something I'll say I'm starting to learn from this recent election in the US is that, we're speaking a lot about like, the injustices and people like being aware of a microaggression. But I will say that let's also, like, a white straight man also understanding the dynamics that impact him and how he sees the world are really important also in that space, right? And I'm saying that because some analysis of the election that do make sense to me is that the Democrats were so focused on, quote unquote woke DEI culture and identity politics, that they like didn't really make space for this like masculine, aspirational masculinity, and like what are white men like, where do they kind of fit in there, and what is their experience like when they're being told that they're problematic all the time and they need to like step back and make space. I say this as someone who is and was that person and is that person saying that, we need to make space and need to approach things differently. But also as therapists, like, we have to hold that everyone, like, of course that's not going to sit so well with people. And how do we hold space for that experience and for them to be validated? But that also doesn't mean that they need to take away something from someone, like, so there's just so much complexity in it. And so I just feel called to be like, it's not even only the so-called, the people who are experiencing more oppression, but like even people who are part of a more privileged identity. Like, it's really important also to dig into what that means, how that feeds people. Like, people with great wealth, for example, like there's so much to dig into that experience and how that impacts how people like exist in the world and operate in their own safety, healing, how they, perceive how other people interact with them. So I kind of think all of that is under this like social justice umbrella. To me, it just means like how we understand society and what is just and unjust and how that impacts us as an individual. And it's just so important for the therapeutic work and beyond. And of course, creating access. And I will say, I guess we didn't touch on that, but just, of course, that it's scary, at least in the US, that psychedelic therapy is set to be so expensive, and understanding like who will actually have access and who doesn't. So when you say social justice psychedelics, I guess another piece coming up is making sure that it's accessible, not just cost-wise, but in a culturally adaptive, legitimate way for a wide range of people too.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm going to bookmark that and get into something about the Australian context in a moment. I'm just going to kind of go, but
please, I'm curious.
But I really want to, like the piece that you were talking to before that around complexity and the importance of people seeing multiple perspectives. One of the things that I really value about the psychedelics work that I do and that I have done as a therapist, that I've really noticed and been struck by, is it in journeys often it is not true for everyone, not true for every journey. I always say this on this podcast, that everything I share is like, it's every psychedelic journey is different. But a theme that I've noticed is that it brings up kind of multiple perspectives on the same thing, and that it's okay to hold two like dichotomous things together. Like, it's okay, and like the light, light and the dark, which is such a part of who we are. We've got like there's light and there's dark, or it's not about good and bad as being only one thing or the other thing, but holding together the good and the bad, the difficult and the amazing, the really challenging and the really straightforward. And how do you hold, it allows people to hold all of that.
It's so important. I call it like holding duality. And
Yes.
it's just our society that we were talking about this is becoming so black and white, so polarized. There's no space for holding duality, which, we see in Israel, Palestine, we see in millions of contexts. And it's literally killing us that we can't hold a fuller truth. And, but I understand why it feels hard for some people, especially if they're still in their, like, in a place of trauma and fear and not feeling safe. That kind of duality feels a little more wobbly, right? It's a little less stake on the ground. This is right, this is wrong. And that can feel like safety to people. And I think it's quite difficult sometimes for people to hold that it isn't ever that simple, and that two things can be true at once.
Yeah, they can. And trauma on a kind of more kind of societal level, all of the trauma that we've been through with COVID-19 pandemic, with all of the kind of multiple conflicts that have unfolded in the last 10, 15 years, and the way in which that's unfolded online, quite like, in terms of people experiencing vicarious trauma from watching a lot of content in a different way than they would have been able to even 10 years ago. I think that all of that is kind of sitting underneath this polarization. It's part of what's happening. There's fear in the community, and so then because of that fear, their mind is much more likely to opt for this black and white thinking, to try to create some safety, which is such a common and understandable protective thing that people do to protect themselves from actually feeling all of that fear and that pain. But also it then perpetuates the fear and the pain, doesn't it?
Totally. And then we have social media that's like just flashing things to make us upset. And like duality is harder to put into an Instagram square. It's easier to be one thing or the other. And that's what gets people to click and angry and reshare. And yes, to all you're saying, I just think social media exacerbates it so much.
So much. Yeah, absolutely. And I if I think about like just before I stepped out of direct clinical work, working with asylum seekers, in particular, there was many things that made me realize I was getting burnt out, but one of them was that I actually really couldn't have a conversation with someone who had a different viewpoint about asylum seekers to me without getting either really, really upset, like crying, or wanting to yell at them, which is not like me at all. And I thought that that I have to go and do some work on whatever all this vicarious trauma is and how I'm holding it in my body, so that I can go back into the space and maybe come at this activism in a different way. And it's important.
Do you know the book Trauma Stewardship?
No, I don't know that one.
I want to plug that my supervisor in social work school gave me. It's all about vicarious trauma. And it's a really beautiful book. It has a lot of like cartoons. It's like kind of both easy to read, but deep. Trauma Stewardship. Highly recommend. And yeah, that's such a resonant experience. I remember that supervisor gave it to me. I was working at the alternative sentencing court with people arrested for prostitution. And I got set up on a blind date with someone who worked at like Goldman Sachs. And he was like, yeah, like I had a really hard day today. And I was like, oh, really? Like my client was like raped at knife point. Like you had a hard day. And I like literally tore into him and had no capacity to hold any other. And I was like, whoa, okay, I see how but it's hard when you're living in a certain world and other people don't see it and have such strong opinions. It's like, although something I'm reminded of that you said earlier, I wanted to ask you, you were talking about how difficult, and I understand that it can be to talk to some people who do not have your shared experience and beliefs right now. And then we were talking about grief. And I'm wondering, for those people, do you think if they were able to speak to like their pain of like what grief they were holding and what they were so sad about, that led them to that belief, if that would make it easier for you to hold space, because usually it's like, no, you're right. It's like more of like an angry energy. And I have that, that's
Yes.
like a theory I have, and I'm curious if you experience that.
Yes, I think it would be. I think it would be a lot easier, and also it's more real. It's more like, because otherwise your defensive parts are having a conversation. It's like in any kind of conflict, and the reason that I didn't kind of want to get into it with this person is because I felt like I would be in that kind of angry space as well. And reason that I felt that, I know what it is. It's like, it's my own personal history of trauma related to patriarchal system, related to harms that have happened to me in my life. And I know that. And so I think if we were able to both perhaps meet each other in that place of like, actually, I feeling a lot of grief right now because I'm holding this pain from this stuff that happened. And how about you? And how did you get to that? I think that's a different conversation.
Totally. But it's
Yeah.
one most of us don't, even if we have the capacity for, sometimes it's almost impossible to find the appropriate container, time, space to be like, okay, now we're going to talk about our deepest wounds. Like, that's not
Yeah.
the easiest thing. And I think that's why our society has so little space for these conversations, sadly.
Yeah, totally. I think so too. I hope to be able to. I do think there are people in my life who I could do that with. So we'll see.
Mm. And of
Um,
course, sometimes maybe medicine might help in those conversations.
yeah.
That's
Yeah.
really like I dream with MDMA, especially to
Mm,
help people have some of these more difficult defensive conversations and drop them into a different level. I really believe it could help us understand each other a lot better.
yes, absolutely. I think so too, because we're out of that fear place in our brain, right? The
Exactly.
amygdala, the limbic system is a little less active, and so our frontal lobes can do more, and we're just more able to hear one another. So that's really
Totally.
helpful, and I hope so too. I'm excited for what the research can hold, and one of the things about Australia is that the rescheduling to allow us to treat certain conditions is amazing, but also the rescheduling is opening up more doors to different kinds of research, which is
Wow.
something that I'm really excited for.
That's amazing. May I actually ask you a question
Yeah.
about stuff in Australia?
Yes,
I'm
please.
just wondering, like, I haven't heard of that many like negative experiences coming out, and all we're hearing is that there aren't actually that many therapists and doctors trained. MAPS has done a few trainings, but
Yes.
that's not enough for everyone. And so I am curious if there have been some difficult incidences that just have not made it to the media, or if it seems to be really going like cautiously and going, knock wood, well so far.
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it relates a bit to the equity thing that we were just speaking about. So, and the regulatory system. So, what I'd say is it's still a relatively a very small number of people who have. So, the way it works is that there's the unauthorized prescriber who has to be a psychiatrist, can kind of get a license to practice. And then there's lots of rules and around how and this sort of process. And so there's not that many people doing it. First of all, there are some. There's a problem around cost. So it's currently in the model because they've said that it needs to be kind of like, which I think I understand why they've done this. Like, it has to follow the same trajectory as, say, a trial. So 3 preparation, dosing, 3 integration, dosing, 3 integrations with 2 therapists. It's expensive because also not the insurance companies and Medicare haven't come on board yet, although that's changing. And by the time this podcast comes out, that might not be totally up to date.
Ooh, cool.
Just to say that, but it is, it's very expensive at the moment. And so I guess I would encourage anyone listening who really wants to get to try to benefit from this at a lower cost to look at trials, which there are many, many trials offering this kind of service, but it's so, I'm sure there are negative experiences, but there's not many experiences in general.
And when you're saying there are all these trials, is there any going on in Australia with group work? Because, not only do Indigenous communities tend to sit in group to begin with as a better experience, but it's also definitely more cost effective. So I'm curious
Yeah.
if that's being explored.
I don't know if there's any stuff that are currently running, but I know that there's lots of people thinking about that and trying to get things off the
Cool.
ground. And also there's a lot of group integration programs and things popping up and people doing that work in the group space, which is really, really nice. But I think one of the challenges that I think I've seen or heard about and also personally experienced in trying to do this work within that medical model, which is where it's been rescheduled, has been that, for example, people with treatment-resistant depression, the people that are coming through to us are people who've been very kind of within the medical system. And so then we're kind of working with them with a psychedelic lens that in some ways is helpful in the medical system, but also doesn't quite fit. And that we also need to be thinking more about the social political lens and what we're sending people back into, because often these people have been very disempowered in their life. They've had a lot of social inequality and trauma. And so we can do this psychedelic work, but then what else do we need to do in the integration space?
Totally. And also to have this psychedelic healing experience and connection with spirituality, and then to come home to a family or a community that has no idea what you experienced, it can be really, really challenging. So
yes. I there's some great work happening. People are starting to look at like bringing families in and bringing partners in, and
cool.
That's been really nice. But I think I've been nervous about, I guess, the lack of understanding around what we're actually doing. That's one of the reasons for this podcast and how this works. And then kind of psychiatrists are suddenly the ones who have the power to get the license, which I, on one level, understand why they did it that way, but also I think there's a psychoeducation piece for the community that needs to happen. We're all kind of working on. We need we need lots of people who do the global impact officer job for Australia specifically, right? To explain like this is what we're doing. That psychedelic work is different from a kind of more symptom reduction approach. So what I was trying to get at, I'm not quite sure if I did quite get there in my explanation before, is that the people that are coming through, say with treatment-resistant depression, they've been treated in a very symptom reduction kind of approach in the medical model, whereas psychedelics is really getting to the core. And so sometimes during the process of psychedelic work, things can feel harder for people. Things can all start to come up. Things can feel more difficult, which is quite confronting for the people around them. The person, yes, but we can support that, and we kind of talk about that a lot, and we explain that that's likely to happen. But it's the people around them that we haven't necessarily been able to reach as well. So we've been thinking about how we can do that. But it's like we're kind of trying to, I guess what I find hard is trying to work with people who've been in the medical model with using psychedelics in that medical model, but psychedelics kind of naturally turn the medical model a little bit on its head.
Definitely.
Does that make sense? Did I get there?
Totally.
I think, yeah, that's been my biggest challenge.
No, it is a really big challenge. And I mean, just even the concept of an inner healing intelligence, that we talk about in the MAPS training, about how to like listen to your body and yourself to lead the way forward. And our current model is so much about going to a doctor to heal you. And it's like, and it's just such a different framework. And it's also when stuff emerges, like what you're saying, like a repressed memory about a family member being abusive or something, that can be explosive for a family. And how to like hold space for all of that is not easy work. No.
Yeah, that's right. So I think we're learning, and I think one of the things that is really important is really good therapist training. And because some psychiatrists have done lots of psychotherapy training, and some psychologists have done further training in psychotherapeutic approaches, but there's definitely a need for more of that, which is why I'm so excited to be about to head off. I'm going to get off this call and start packing for the MAPS
Oh,
residential. So,
I'm so excited for
because it feels
you.
really important to skill people up in this new way, which has so
Totally
much
is.
hope if done well. Yeah.
Totally. And as important as the actual training is, I really think the most important part is actually the cohort, like that you have leaving the training. So you have a group of people that you trust that you can go to for advice, for questions, because this is all new. And as you say, there's like infinite difficulties in this work, and we need to be in community to figure this out together. If you're trying to do this lone wolf style, it is not going to be safe. Like just point
Yeah.
blank, it is not safe to me if someone does it
Yeah.
that way. And in the underground, a lot of people did do it that way for safety reasons. And I think that made it even more dangerous than it needed to be.
Thank you for saying that, because I think you've just hit the nail on the head of something that I have been nervous about, and I'm not the only person who feels this way in rescheduling it with it. The kind of authorized prescriber model is that it sits with one person, a psychiatrist, and there's lots of amazing people who are doing this work in community. And I, have worked just by myself as a therapist for a really long time as a psychotherapist or a psychologist online, but I don't do that. I don't do my psychedelic work like that. I have an amazing dyad partner and a team, and I get worried about the potential that a psychiatrist could be doing it by themselves, or that anyone would do this work alone, because I actually think you need community. And I really like, as much as it's expensive and diff challenging, I think the dyad model of psychedelic therapy is really powerful as well. We just need to work out how to make it more cost effective, and I don't have the answer to that right now in Australia, but it's something that we are really thinking about, and whether there's a kind of like a not-for-profit model that eventually we could get grants from the government around to do this work with marginalized communities, for example, is, it's just a bit too early for that right now. I think we need to do the education piece to get people on board so they really understand what we're doing.
Totally. And my instinct on that is that like there's going to be some combination ultimately between group work, individual work with dyads, all of that. And like that maybe everyone doesn't need only you and two therapists alone the whole time, but you
Totally.
have some group work, some work individually. Maybe part of the group session involves some individual drop-ins, like there's just a
Yeah.
lot of, I think, room to play around in that. And as we both know, there's such deep healing also in the group work, not just in the
Totally.
dyad, but of course also in the dyad. Like I've had some of my
Yeah.
most strong experience actually one-on-one, not with the dyad, but like, one-on-one space is also deeply powerful. So I'm not
Yes.
trying to only talk about the group, but I just know there's a lot to be gained from like mixing and matching a little, finding the right balance for every person, which will be different too.
Yes. And that's really important to hold, isn't it? That there's not one way of healing that suits everyone. It's really important that we have different options and things that are available. And I run a group program called Embodying Playfulness, which is a somatic kind of therapy group program. And I do that. And sometimes people come who are my clients one-on-one, and sometimes it's usually a mix of all these different people. Some people I don't know, some people I work with a lot. And the power, like there's a magic in that group process,
Such
like
magic.
that I just couldn't bring as a one-on-one therapist, of people hearing from each other, which was really amazing.
It's so profound.
Well, I'm mindful of time. Is there anything that we haven't covered or that you really want to kind of mention before we wrap up, or ask me, or have we done it?
I mean, I have a lot more questions for you, but I'm trying to think what that. Yeah, I guess one question would be, you mentioned, I'm thrilled to hear about the indigenous medicine, like psychedelic group in Australia that you're working with. Do you know if there's any like conversation about like native Australian plant medicine? Because I know that many cultures also keep that within and are not so eager to just share it with with other
Mm.
people. But I'm curious if that's like a part of the conversation, or if the organization is more focused on empowering indigenous community and creating access to like more traditional psychedelics.
I don't want to speak for them too much, but I will put some of that to them when they come on the podcast. But I think my understanding of IPAT is that they're looking at both. It's more about looking at Indigenous principles and ways of healing to, number one, ensure that, like, to try to create culturally safe places for people from Indigenous backgrounds in Australia to have psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, because the ways that it's done in very much a westernized frame that doesn't feel culturally safe for those communities. And so they're very interested in that, but also into bringing some of these ideas and principles into the practice in general, because it's good for all people. So, and
Beautiful.
so they've just had an article released recently, and I'll put that in the show notes. Their first article they published. And I think, so I would say that Australia is a place where there's not been open discussion around Australian Indigenous use of plant medicine. And I suspect that is because there's been a lot of extractive practice in Australia and a lot of kind of unhealed trauma. But the principles around Indigenous healing are something that we've been speaking about, and it feels really important to talk about in this space.
Beautiful. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Oh, it's been so lovely, Natalie. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This has been so much fun. And I really appreciate your questions and all the beautiful work that you're doing. Really loved getting to know you a bit better. Thank you so much for having me on.
No problem.